Microsoft Office 365 deployment overview. My name is Mark Haneen, and I'm a part of the Microsoft Office 365 Enterprise Process and Tools team.
And my name is Steve Daigle, and I'm a deployment architect for the Lively Education Office 365 for Education deployment team.
So before I get started and getting into what the session's about and what takeaways you have, just a show of hands, how many of you guys are partners, Microsoft partners? Oh, wow, okay. Just customers? And then what's other? Let's see what's other, okay? All right, so basically we got a fair mix of customers and partners. So today what we'll be talking about is, what are the key aspects of planning, preparing, and migrating to Office 365 for enterprises. We'll be focusing on the enterprises SKU, not education, not dedicated, federal, or for small business. Although for small business you could really do many of the activities that are associated to planning, preparing, and migrating based on the conversation we're going to have today. But if you do have those questions, we will be around most of the afternoon, one of us at the booths or after the session. So key takeaway that you should be able to walk out of this room with is, what are the key aspects of deploying an Office 365 for enterprises customer. Some key deployment resources that you should be aware of. Probably the first one is the community. That's really a perfect site for you to go to during the beta and as we go into general availability. Lots of information directly from the product groups, deployment teams, et cetera, that you'll find in there, and that's just community.office365.com. Around the general availability time frame, we'll release the Deployment Central site for Office 365 called deployoffice365.com. And on that site, what you'll find is a one-pager doc, what we call a quick reference, that if you wanted to have a discussion with your CXO or your customer about what it takes to go into the cloud, you would look at this quick overview guide, this one-pager document, and hopefully should be able to relay the key aspects of deploying Office 365. The additional document that we will release, and we've already released in beta format, is the Microsoft Online Deployment Guide. In the Microsoft Online Deployment Guide, it's approximately 177 pages of everything you would need to know related to deploying Office 365. So it's an in-depth deployment document. And then finally, right now available in the beta is the Office 365 deployment readiness tool. And that tool is designed to help you understand what are the key statistical information associated to your deployment? What are some of the key blockers? And how can you get past those blockers with the information that's provided in the deployment guide? And so that deployment guide is also available in a web format linked via the community site and also in the tool as you use it. So there are really three basic phases associated with deploying Office 365. There's planning, preparing, and then migrating. For planning, it starts with really the kickoff meeting and discovery. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to encompass in our deployment to Office 365? Do we want to move all our email? Do we want to move just some of our users on premise and some in the cloud? Do we want to potentially do our migration over a few weeks, over a few months? Those sorts of questions are really a part of that kickoff meeting, and understanding your infrastructure on premises is really the key to a successful planning engagement, and that's really what's in the kickoff meeting. The second phase is prepare. So you've gone through, you've done the due diligence and plan, and now you actually begin executing the process to get yourself into the cloud. The first phase of that is, after you've registered your domain in the service, you'll then begin what's called the directory synchronization process, which will synchronize the content from your on-premises Active Directory into the cloud, as well as what we'll talk about later, enabling your organization for enterprise single sign-on. And that's really with the features of Active Directory Federation Services 2.0. The next step, or that next part of the phase, is enabling the Exchange 2010 native tools. We do have a variety of tools that will get you in the cloud to migrate your mail infrastructure into Office 365. But what we'll be focusing on today is Office 365 for enterprises, and therefore you will, in an enterprise deployment, we'll give you the flexibility of the Exchange 2010 native tools inside of the deployment. And then all the while you're going through this process, if you choose to do a rich client deployment, meaning you want to have the full experience of Office 2010 enterprise single sign-on, then there'll be some components that you'll need to push out to your client PCs. And then finally, it's migrating. So the actual process of moving your mail infrastructure into the cloud. If you notice, I haven't mentioned SharePoint and other aspects, and I'll talk about that later, but these are the things that are provided as a part of the service, where we provide you the tools, the process, the guidance to get you into the cloud. And in the case of SharePoint, for example, we leverage some of our partners to assist you in getting some of your content from your on-premises environment to Office 365. So this is just a sample deployment schedule. Again, the first week you're going to start off with your kickoff meeting. Some of this stuff's pretty obvious, but what we want to really highlight is, after you've gone through that environmental discovery, potentially using the Office 365 deployment readiness tool, going through the questionnaire or solution alignment workshop that we reference in the deployment guide, you'll then move on to the actual preparation phase in deployment. If you notice, we have Exchange, SharePoint, Link, networking, identity, and client and end user tasks all stacked on top of each other. And what we're trying to emphasize here is that there are some aspects of deployment that you can do in parallel with each other, and that'll affect your overall timeline. Now, in this example, we're showing a customer that's deploying in about 12 weeks. Your overall time to deploy in the cloud is going to vary. It's not necessarily based on the number of users you have. It's going to vary on the complexity of your deployment. Are you migrating content into the cloud? Those sorts of things. And again, the deployment guide and the readiness tool will help you start to make those assessments and those determinations. So we'll dive into plan and talk about some of the key areas of planning. Again, we talked about the kickoff or the solution alignment workshop. That's really a critical aspect in a deployment. You start to set expectations. This is what we can do in the cloud. This is what we can't do. These are the features that are available. These are not. And maybe there's some new features that you didn't have on premises that you need to start considering, right? Office 365 is based on effectively the latest versions of Exchange, Link, SharePoint. And in some cases, the service doesn't have everything that you have on premises, but in the case of Exchange specifically, you'll find that we have a significant number of features that have never been available before in our online services. And again, that's where you're going to perform your gap analysis. What are we potentially willing to change to move to the cloud? What are we willing, or what can we potentially now add into our business processes that we didn't have before? And that's really where you'll fill in those gaps or discuss those gaps in the gap analysis discussion. Probably one of the bigger considerations is internet bandwidth, right? So now you're looking at deploying a solution across the internet. You don't have a dedicated line. It's not a part of your local area network, if you will. You have to now make considerations as to how much internet bandwidth are you going to use, not just during the migration, because that's definitely a critical aspect if you're migrating content from your on-premises Exchange environment, for example, to the cloud, but also with new features. Maybe you've never used Link or SharePoint. How much more additional bandwidth might I need in order to consume or leverage the service? And that's really where going through a trial of the Office 365 solution really helps you start to make that determination. You're not going to get a full assessment on how every user will leverage the service, but it'll give you a good idea as to, okay, I see what this all is on paper, but going through it and experiencing it makes a big difference in understanding how this will work for my organization, when I do move to the cloud. Project plan is critical, right? So it's really going to be your blueprint as to, who's going to move at what time. Specifically, examples that we've seen with conference rooms, for example. If you're planning on moving everybody on the 3rd floor of building X, it probably makes sense to move the conference room from your on-premises Exchange environment, as well as those users that would leverage that, right? So those are some of the considerations that you would have when you're starting to outline your project plan. Inside of the service, we're going to really talk about rich coexistence or Exchange 2010 native tools. We also provide free of charge hosted Exchange tools that are a part of the service. So there may be a potential where if you have a smaller organization that might be part of your company, that you choose not to do rich coexistence and use one of those hosted tools and quickly cut them over into the cloud. That's just an example of something that we've seen already inside of the private beta. But understanding those mailbox migration tools from what Microsoft has to offer and our partners also are really critical in this process, because in some cases, Microsoft tools may provide you something that you really need, and then there's something that we may not offer, and then a third party might be able to fill in that gap. So going through that due diligence and understanding that. I would say right now from what we see, most customers are doing rich coexistence and leveraging the Exchange rich coexistence features with pretty good success. ADFS design. So one of the major shifts between the Business Productivity Online Standard Suite, which is the previous version of our hosted services, and Office 365, is the ability to leverage a server-based single sign-on solution. So with that additional feature or that added benefit, you do have to understand what it takes to deploy Active Directory Federations 2.0 on premises and how that'll integrate with your environment. So the design of ADFS will be important in this process. Again, for rich coexistence, and there will be some sessions later on this week that deep dive sessions on Exchange that you can learn about. But for rich coexistence, what we're really focusing on is that you do have to have an on-premises rich coexistence server, an Exchange 2010 SP1 server, SP2 at GA, that will assist in migrating the mailboxes, that will allow for free busy between your on-premises environment and the cloud as you're going through your deployment. The Exchange coexistence servers, in some cases, if you're doing a cutover and you have all of your users moving in the cloud, you only need them for a certain duration, then you can decommission. If you want to go in the rich coexistence or hybrid model where maybe part of your organization's on premises and part of it's in the cloud, then you'll want to plan for leaving those servers on premises for whatever that duration of time is. And then finally, mobility requirements. So moving into the cloud, there are a variety of different mobile devices that are out there, and there are differences between what you can do with a BlackBerry device on premises versus in the cloud, and we'll be talking about BlackBerry here in a little bit, or any other ActiveSync device, whether it's an Android, Windows Phone, iPhone. So we'll talk about some of the key considerations just based on customer learnings. So one thing I didn't really mention that Steve and our team does, is we go back and we talk to partners. We understand, okay, what were some of the challenges that you had going through the deployment? We talk to customers. What were the things that if you would have known up front, you would have maybe changed and done a little bit differently? And one of them, I think that is a fairly common one, is network planning. Understanding what my bandwidth considerations are during the migration, and then once I move into the cloud. Because they'll vary, and they're going to also vary based on the tool that you select. So obviously download considerations are important, because depending on the migration tool that you select, you may have to once you've moved a user into the cloud, that user may have to download their mail back onto their PC, which will require additional bandwidth from a download perspective that you may have not considered. Now, with rich coexistence, again, that's what we focus on with enterprise, Office 365 for enterprises. What we do is something that's pretty slick. Well, we maintain the OST locally, so you don't have to re-download the mail when you do your migration. So the different tools, again, when you go through that due diligence for migration tools, will it'll be important to understand, what are some of the pros and the cons associated with, tools with network planning, as for an example. Now, necessary patches. So with the rich experience of Office 365, in order to get all the benefits of Office 365 in a rich experience, you will have to download some patches on users' PCs. If you don't have a centralized application distribution system, effectively each one of those PCs would have to download those updates to their machines. In most cases, what we found is customers have some sort of solution, whether it's Windows Update or Microsoft Update or System Center. But it's important to understand, what is the total amount of bandwidth that I'll need to get each PC ready to roll for Office 365. From an upload perspective, when you're moving mail from your on-premises environment to the cloud, you'll need to have an understanding, well, what is the network bandwidth that I'm using today, plus what do I need to move X number of users per day, per night, whatever the case may be, into the cloud, because you will be taking some bandwidth that you hadn't considered in the past. And again, another example is with existing collaboration, whether you have SharePoint or public folders that you might be moving to SharePoint and then into the cloud. Those are things to have take into consideration, because again, those will take up some of your upload bandwidth. So we kind of highlighted the migration tool considerations. OST, as for example, not having to re-download that is inherently a part of Exchange 2010 rich coexistence. One thing that I think is important from firewalls, proxies, and switches, I just was reading about this with a customer of ours. It's really important to understand your network layout. This customer was migrating several users during their migration, several mailboxes, and it was taking an exceptionally long time. When we started to analyze why it was taking such a long time, found that before they got to the internet, they had 3 or 4 hops, right? So in general, the best performance that you're going to get is the closest to your egress point. The faster your migration is going to be, right? You want to reduce the number of hops that it takes to get to your endpoint. Some simple things, found 10 half duplex switches, right? So things that you would think were working fine, those are the things that you might want to consider checking before you start digging into your migration. And so new data centers, what we do is inside of the online deployment guide, we focus on what our data center IP ranges are, so on your firewall what you have to configure. In some cases, you don't have to do anything. In some cases, you do, depending on the way you've configured your network edge devices. All right, so we'll dig into user identity and provisioning. So I talked about the authentication mechanisms that we have available in Office 365. And the most popular one, the one that people ask the most about, is enterprise single sign-on. So again, that's really the ability for your users to log onto their machine with their corporate credentials, and then when they double-click on Outlook, not have to provide an additional credential to leverage any of the Office 365 services. So Outlook is an example, right? And let's just say, that's not something that you or your customer would like. You have to understand, again, what the other options are, and there's really only one, which is what we call Managed ID. And Managed ID has, it's just a separate user ID. It's another password, but we have some constraints. What are the number of characters that you can have in your password, what are the complexity requirements, those sorts of things. And it's really important to understand as you start to define how are users going to consume the service and authenticate into the service. How many of you guys have BPOS standard or working with BPOS standard? Okay. So there's a session that's later on, and I think we have it at the end of this deck, that talks about how it works when a customer in BPOS moves into Office 365. So just a real brief outline of the last three is that our BPOS S standard customers or V1 customers will have managed IDs. So they'll have a separate user ID and password, but then they have the opportunity after everybody's been migrated to move into leveraging single sign-on. So this is just a basic diagram that just highlights how a user is authenticated when they leverage Office 365 with single sign-on. Again, in a nutshell, it's what I said. You log onto your computer. You don't need to know that your mailbox is on premises or in the cloud. When you open up Outlook or go into SharePoint, you're granted access to those resources automatically. So the key from an explicit and implicit cost discussion that you may have is that you won't have this overhead of users needing to remember another cloud password, another password. Administrators can retain existing domain security policies. You can do auditing, all those sorts of things that you're accustomed to in your on-premises world, all in one place in your on-premises Active Directory. And additionally, by using single sign-on, if you have the requirements of multi-factor authentication, that does provide you, single sign-on provides you that capability that managed ID does not. And then again, you have the ability, depending on how you design your ADFS infrastructure, to block access outside your corporate network if you wish. So some key ADFS planning considerations. We currently are not supporting multi-forest for directory synchronization and with ADFS or single sign-on. But we're looking to provide that solution sometime after GA, so no committed time, but we're looking to provide that as an available solution. It's important to understand that single sign-on or ADFS 2.0 is highly dependent on the attribute in Active Directory called user principal name or UPN. And what you'll find as you go through a discovery of your customer's on-premises environment is that not every user principal name is going to be perfect before you move into the cloud. So there are two parts to this. One, just some general hygiene suggestions that you'll need to make some changes to some of your user principal names on premises, but also have an understanding that there may be a reason why those UPNs are potentially malformed, if you will. Whether you have maybe like a Unix application or a smart card application that relies on UPN, you'll need to make an assessment up front. Is this something that we can change or not in order to resolve some potential upfront issues with a client deployment. Now I'll talk about that. I'll demonstrate that here in a little bit. So from a design perspective, you'll need to really consider, what do I need to have on premises in order to make this work? Again, since we're focusing on Office 365 for enterprises, we're really looking at, what would a large enterprise do to deploy? So in general, what we suggest is that, and we have this outlined in the document, is that you want to have these on separate servers, meaning your ADFS federation server and your ADFS proxy servers, and in a redundant design, right? Because effectively, you have a single point of failure for authentication if, in fact, if one machine maintained your ADFS or maintained your SSO configuration and logons. If that actually failed, then you would not be able to leverage the resources in the cloud. So redundancy is a critical aspect in deploying single sign-on. Again, that's highlighted in depth inside the deployment guide.
You also want to make note if you have 50,000 objects or more in your Active Directory that you want to have a dedicated SQL server for the ADFS deployment as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So one of the nice things about the readiness tool is that when you execute it, it's going to really find a lot of the low-hanging fruit deployment blockers and tell you these are the things that you'll need to do up front, which makes a significant difference when you're really planning to deploy Office 365 inside of your organization. So for Exchange Online, and really this is the case for Lync and SharePoint, and I'll say this in the upcoming slides, is you really want to understand what's in the service and what's not, right? And that's what we list inside of the service descriptions. How many of you guys have seen the Office 365 beta service descriptions? How many of you know where it is? Okay, so they're always in the download center. So if you go to Microsoft.com/downloads, you type in Office 365 service descriptions. When you open up I think it's one file for all the services, it'll give you a really good idea. What can I do? Journaling, archiving, or all the things that you might want to plan for. It's going to tell you inside of the service descriptions, and that's really where you can evaluate and plan for the new features that are a part of Office 365. Active Directory and Active Directory Health are critical aspects in deploying Exchange Online, right? Specifically, objects and attributes that you'll be bringing into the cloud, right? So, as an example, with your global address list for Exchange is generated from Active Directory. So if you have, invalid first names, invalid last names, display names, those sorts of things, those will affect your overall experience that users will see inside of Office 365. Some new things that we didn't have in BPOS is the ability to plan group permissions and provide role-based access control at a granular level. So there's two parts of it. There's one aspect of what you can do inside of Office 365. Then there's a second part of what you can do inside of Exchange Online. So that's something that you definitely want to sit down and kind of lay out. Maybe the help desk at this organization or your organization has specific rights, and you want to make sure you mimic those rights and abilities on premises in the cloud. It's going to be an important discussion, an important planning consideration that you'll want to take into account up front. Again, determine your migration or coexistence path. So with the hybrid methodology, you have the ability to say, okay, well, I'm going to put all my customer service employees in the cloud, and then my execs are still going to stay on premises because I may need to do some special archiving or journaling of their mailboxes that I want to keep on premises. And maybe we have that available in the cloud, which we do, but I want to do some special things that I can't do, that I don't want available inside of Office 365. And we provide you those sorts of flexibility up front within Exchange Online, but you definitely want to plan for that and understand, what are the pros and what are the cons associated to that. So again, we talked about migration and the different paths and which partners may be best suited for your migration. This one's the next section, Exchange Web Services and Remote PowerShell. So we added these APIs. It gives you a lot more flexibility as to what you can do with Exchange Online, right? So it's important to understand with Office 365 that specifically for Exchange, that Exchange Web Services is the primary API that you can leverage in the cloud. So, there are some that you cannot use, like basically anything before 2010, that you can't use. That it's important to understand, well, maybe I have this line of business application that, person gets hired on at my company, day one, they get an email account, they get, their SAP PeopleSoft account, they get their domain account. Well, those processes may have to change, right? Because some of the APIs that we have inside of Office 365 are no longer applicable if they're, let's say, Exchange 2003. I guess I should have phrased that right, but I think you guys get the gist of it. And so really, you'll just need to begin that consideration of what do I maybe have to convert. And we have a tool that's called the Legacy API Scanner. You can analyze your on-premises Exchange environment and see, what if anything do I need to port over to Exchange Web Services. So for Lync 2010, again, it's just really look at the service descriptions. For the first edition of Lync in the cloud, it's fairly basic. You have IAM, presence, and those sorts of things. But as As we evolve that service, and there's definitely a roadmap for a lot of very slick things, you'll want to, one, plan for today, but also plan for tomorrow with, what potential, services within Link 2010 that you may want to, or features that you may want to use. Now, one final aspect is federation. Do I want to have the ability for, my end users to talk to people in the outside world with Windows Live or other tenants, those sorts of things? And that's both in the service description and in the online deployment guide. So SharePoint Online, there's a lot more capability, a lot more functionality that we have with SharePoint that we didn't have before in BPOS. But some of the things that you may have encountered in BPOS are really the same. But reading the service descriptions will provide you the best data as to the granular questions that you may have associated to deploying SharePoint sites and so on and so forth. And really, one of the key things that I think is still imperative is understanding your content management strategy. How am I going to, one, look at my on-premises SharePoint environment and potentially archive and delete that information before I move into the cloud. But then when I'm in the cloud, how do I want to maintain the content? Do I want to have expirations? Do I want to look and see how this is being used? Well, we give you fairly good guidance inside the online deployment guide and the SharePoint planning guide as to how you may want to approach that. There's still the same limitations. We have, you can't put EXEs or VBS or .com or CHM files, and there's still a 250 meg threshold for upload that is the maximum that's allowed. I'm not going to go in significant depth because I think our last edition of the SharePoint Planning and Online Deployment Guide goes through really, really good depth as to what you'd want to consider when deploying SharePoint Online. I talked about this earlier. We don't provide any free or hosted migration tools, but we have some very strong partners in this, and that Quest and Metalogix are really probably the most popular two that'll help you get into the cloud. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are planning for migrating content on premises to Office 365? Okay. So, working with these vendors, and I think most of them are here. They have a really good strategy as to what's coming up in the near future and then in the long term. I think will be very beneficial. I'd probably drop by to at least Quest and Metalogix. I think we have a few others. Hopefully, I'm not discounting any of the others, but a few others that could, depending on what you need, would be very helpful. So I get this question a lot. What happened to live meeting? And really what we've done with live meeting is integrated into Link and Link conferencing. So effectively, all the features of live meeting is now under the umbrella of Link. And if you understand what we provided in BPOS S, it's very similar, hasn't changed very much, if at all, what your expectations may be. And the limitations, the number of people that you can have in a conference, those sorts of things are basically the same, but now it's embedded inside of the Link product. And then finally, just to highlight some of the client pieces, is understanding which machines are going to be ready for the cloud and which are not. And the deployment readiness tool will look at the operating systems of domain joined machines inside the forest. And the reason we look at domain joined machines is, one, it's easy to find that information, but two, in order to have that high fidelity experience of being able to log onto your machine with your corporate credentials and then double click on Outlook and it automatically launching for you without any prompting of credentials, is that your machine does need to be domain joined, and it does need to be we outline it's basically Windows XP Service Pack 3, Vista Service Pack 2, Windows 7, etc. And if you meet those requirements, then you'll be able to get that end user experience. Again, so from an Office perspective, it's Office 2007, SP2 and above, and Office 2010, of course. And for Macs, it's Office 2011. I guess I forgot to mention Entourage 2008, EWS also does work. Mobile devices. How many of you are intending on using BlackBerry and Office 365? Okay, so we will have BlackBerry service available. It just won't be available at the time of GA. And we're working directly with RIM to provide a hosted solution that has a very high fidelity experience, and that should be available shortly after general availability. And some of that guidance directly will be on Deploy Office 365 when we do go to general availability. Your expectations with really any of the ActiveSync devices are about the same. So you get the same experience that you would have today, whether you're on premises or another solution with our ActiveSync connection into Exchange 2010 or Exchange Online environment. Okay, so we went through planning. Let's talk about prepare and what are the key prepare steps. I'm not going to go in significant depth because I think we talked about a lot of these things, but that first part of it is going through and having to do any of the necessary Active Directory cleanup. I've yet to see a perfect Active Directory environment. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was something wrong with Active Directory before going into the cloud, but it's some of those hygiene tasks that never seem to happen, right? And so what we do is we tell you, okay, here's some of the issues with malformed characters or names that don't look like a first name, names that don't look like a last name. So you want to go up front and make those changes to assist and deploy into the cloud significantly faster, and we'll highlight those sorts of scenarios in the demonstration. You then begin to deploy ADFS and any of the components that you would like, maybe just federation proxy servers. Reduce mailbox size. So you don't necessarily have to reduce the mailbox size in order to move into the cloud. But what we say to reduce your mailbox size is to increase your velocity, right? In some cases, you'll find that users will have emails from 5, 10 years old that they may never ever use or may never need it, right? And although we have these large mailbox sizes available in the cloud, your velocity takes a significant hit in migration when you've got literally thousands of users in that same bucket. So consider reducing mailbox size up front. Then comes in the configuration and setup of directory synchronization. So taking your on-premises directory data and synchronizing that into the cloud. So that'll be critical in providing your global address list with Exchange, but also providing you the information, the metadata about your users that you'll see inside of Exchange, SharePoint, things that you may have already been accustomed to with Active Directory. Comes down then just deploying the coexistence servers for rich coexistence, so you can set yourself up for doing those high velocity migrations. And then what we talked about earlier, just the basics of deploying the necessary updates to get that high fidelity experience with Office 365. So I'll demonstrate this here in a few, but the attribute cleanup is generally one of the most common deployment blockers, right? So before you start, you'll find all kinds of oddities that you may have not even seen or considered, because in the end, when a user is able to authenticate, that's really all they care about. But when you're considering moving from one house to another, or maybe coexisting in one house to the other, you'll then start to find some things that you never really realized were there. Again, that's really where the attribute cleanup comes into play, and the the deployment readiness tool will assist you in making that cleanup process a lot easier. So I talked about we don't provide a multi-forest support at general availability, but show of hands from BPOS customers, anybody do a directory sync forest, so an intermediary forest before they went in the cloud? Okay, good. They can skip this slide. But we are providing solutions in that realm as well. So, we'll talk about UPN real quick, because that's really the most common area where we see challenges. And one thing that's important to understand is that your user principal name has to be a routable domain. So if you have, mark at contoso.local, you can't register .local in the cloud, right? It needs to be a value that you can register that's a true domain name, a routable domain name, if you will. And it doesn't mean that you have to go and change your Active Directory environment, but what it does mean that you would need to have your users have a user principal name that is routable, and probably most likely that'll end up being your email domain. It doesn't necessarily have to be, right? So if I'm contoso.com, then I would change my user's user principal name from contoso.local to contoso.com, and that's an aspect of single sign-on that has to happen if in fact you do have a non-routable user principal name domain suffix. So we talked about single sign-on. We talked about some of the managed IDs. We don't allow for Unicode characters. It must be between 6 to 16 characters. No double quotes. Those sorts of things. It's important to understand those constraints because let's just say you choose not to go the route of single sign-on. For simplicity, what you'd want to be able to do, and not necessarily have to, but what we see a lot of customers want is the ability to, okay, if I have my users reset their on-premises Active Directory password to orange123, I want them to have the ability to have orange123 as their same password in the cloud, right? So you need to understand what the password policies are on premises and then what's available inside of Office 365. So we talked about reducing mailbox sizes to increase velocity, to get to the cloud faster, right? We talked about the need to deploy Exchange Server 2010 coexistence servers, which means you also need to have, at beta it's just SP1 schema, but at GA it will need to be Service Pack 2 schema with Service Pack 2 coexistence servers. And that'll allow you then to enable the federated sharing and the abilities of having some of your users on premises, some of them in the cloud, seeing FreeBSD between those users, and then being able to use the native Exchange 2010 tools to do those migrations. Critical aspect when you're moving into SharePoint Online, whether you're actually migrating data or not, is understanding what your site design is going to be like and how you're going to implement that. And then, again, what are the tools that can help you migrate that content into the cloud? So for Lync, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, the version that will be released at GA, you get the ability for IM, presence, conferencing. It's just understanding, in a nutshell, what your SIP domain will be, and if in fact you'll be moving, your users or coexisting your users with Lync 2010 on premises. And it's kind of a complex subject, but we do provide some pretty good information as to domain namespaces and SIP address namespaces inside the deployment guide that you want to take a look at. Pretty helpful stuff. So in a nutshell, it's having the latest and greatest of on PCs, right? And we support on the Mac, I think it's 10.4 and above. But getting those patches out to the PCs in advance will make a big difference because as you're going through your infrastructure, your on-premises server infrastructure assessment, having those patches deployed to the PCs in advance will make a significant difference on your overall timeline. And if in fact you don't have a System Center or Windows update on premises, that might be something that you'd consider up front to expedite your overall deployment. All right, so we'll get into Migrate, then we'll move on to the demonstration of the readiness tool and a demonstration of the actual key phases. So once you get to Migrate, it's really assigning the appropriate SKUs. We have a variety of different SKUs in Office 365 for enterprises. You'll then assign those SKUs to the people that inside your organization, then begin to enable the features, light those features up that you may have never had before, right? Go through the final end user communications, and conduct the mailbox migrations. Now, we talk about testing the services and make sure everything looks good and changing the MX record. You don't necessarily have to change the MX record. If you're looking to do a long-term coexistence model, you don't really need to, you may not have to change your MX record, but that's if in fact you go through the full cutover. So I'm trying to speed this up so we can make sure we get enough time for questions too. So real quick, like I said, there's several other tools that we provide for free and ways to get there. So the hybrid approach, you'll actually execute the migrations, whether you want to do it programmatically with PowerShell or with the Exchange Management Console. And we have the hosted tools that you see here, the Simple IMAP, Simple Exchange, and then we have Staged Exchange, and that's a typo on the bottom. And then our third-party tools. And these are just examples of different tools that provide you different features. BitTitan is a hosted service. Quest has a certain subset of features that Microsoft solution doesn't have, and likewise with Binary Tree. Talked about third-party tools for SharePoint. Again, it really just comes down to we have a few providers in that realm, which are Quest and Metalogix. And just to really wrap this up, our common deployment blockers are really the infrastructure requirements up front. So maybe doing the cleanup of directory, potentially acquiring on-premises hardware if you need it, the upgrades to clients if they want that rich experience. So be prepared for those long pull items up front, and that'll have a big impact on your overall deployment timeline. Gaps in the service offering. So not everything that's in the service is available, not everything on premises is available in the service. So going through those service descriptions will give you a really good idea as to what you can do and potentially not do with Office 365. And then the final aspect is resources. Understanding who's going to do what, how they're going to do it, what potential time constraints, money, resources that I may need to make this deployment successful. All right, so I know this is not a really crisp diagram, but it is in the guide. I just kind of want to flow through this just to give you a quick idea as to how it works. So you go into the online portal. And again, this looks much clearer in a smaller format. And you're going to add your domain. Inside of the portal, it'll then redirect you and tell you, where you would add your CNAME record. In fact, let me just do this in the demo. See how well this works. All right. So I'm going to log on to the Microsoft Online portal. That's always good. Yeah. And so I'm going to go to domain. So this is inside the domain dialog box. And I'm going to add my domain. So I'm actually going to use a real one, but I'll show you what happens with Contoso. Let's just pick Contoso. So when I click on check domain, it will go out and validate where this is from and who's my registrar. So in this case, it's Melbourne IT, right? I'm going to pick a real one. Okay, so it shows my domain register is GoDaddy. It shows that I own this, right? And once I go in and say next, I've added that into the online portal. And it says my next step that I need to do is to create a CNAME record at GoDaddy. So I would take my alias here, go to GoDaddy. Right? Seems like GoDaddy's a little bit slow right now. So as this loads up, it's going to open up DNS Manager in GoDaddy, and I'll take the information that the online portal gave me and register that with my domain register. So it's just basically it's a CNAME record, right? So I go to this domain, CCS CTP. And I'm going to use DNS Manager inside of my GoDaddy DNS Manager tool. And then I would add the information that was provided to me here inside of the tool. So I go back. Oops. So I would add this alias, and then I'd say it's going to point to ps.microsoftonline.com. I think I already have one, but I'll add it anyway. And then I would save this in my zone file. And then within 15 minutes or more, but usually it's 15 minutes, when I go inside of the online portal under domains, it will show that, that I have been verified, that I own this domain, and that I can continue on with the next step. And so that next step would be directory cleanup, right? So directory cleanup, I'll effectively take a look at the results that I found from the deployment readiness tool and make those changes. And I'll show you those here in a second. After I've gone through that directory cleanup process, then I want to move on to enabling identity federation or single sign-on, directory synchronization, right? So taking what I have on premises in my on-premises Active Directory and syncing that into the cloud, and then move on to my Exchange steps. So let me show you how the deployment readiness tool works. Let's see here. Okay, so I will go to the community. I should go here. community.office365.com. And I'll type in deployment readiness tool. I'll read through the overview, system requirements, and of course the EULA. Save that offline. And one thing that's important to understand, the tool is designed to be extremely easy to run. You don't need to know what your DNs are for your forests or your domains. You don't need to know really anything. It's supposed to be turnkey. So once you download it to your desktop and you double click on it, run it, what it's going to do is it's going to get your domain partition information. It's going to get the key information about your environment that it needs to go in and get an analysis of your on-premises directory. So as it sits here, what it's doing is just doing LDAP queries, extracting the content that's relevant to your Office 365 deployment. And then when it's done, it's going to provide you a list of here's what we found on premises. And we'll go through, we pre-ran this. I'll show you what we've got. Let's take this example customer example here. So it's going to say, okay, these are the domains that I found. These are the domains that people are using inside of your environment. So in this case, the most common domain, probably the one that you're going to end up registering inside of the online portal is this one, msodexonline.info, and saying, okay, at least this is your most common domain with at least 50 users assigned to it. And if you want to know, okay, well, it looks like you found 3 others. Let's see what they are. Well, there's 30 people that are using msodexonline.info. There's one that's using this whatever it is .jp, and then there's a double @ sign, which is an invalid proxy, and we purposely put that in there. There's one person that has that. So this is really important to understanding the environment. How many people are in it, how many people are using these domains, and what am I potentially going to need to do when I register my domain inside the cloud. It discovered an issue. It said, okay, I found non-routable email domain or a single label domain. So the service does not support like Contoso, right? So you could have contoso.com, but not just Contoso. that's what a single label domain is. So we discovered that and tell you that up front. So let's say you're trying to scope an engagement, understand, well, how long will this potentially take, right? So we'll tell you how many users were discovered, how many contacts, how many groups, how many mailboxes were discovered. Then you can start to scope your engagement or scope maybe licenses, right? So maybe you want to say, well, how much are we going to end up, investing per month with the service, right? In this case, it's a fairly small example. It's a test environment. We look for trust and say, okay, looks like we found some trust. If these are not log-on domains, these are ones that you don't intend on having people use to log on to the service and log on to their PC with, then you can ignore them. But if you do, understanding that there's multi-forest constraints, here's where you go to read about that, and it clicks directly into the online deployment guide and explains what the multi-forest constraints are. And then effectively, when we do have a solution that we'll release, you'll be able to find that information directly inside the online deployment guide. Back. We look at schema and forest / domain functionality levels. Those are important. There's certain requirements for ADFS, and there's certain requirements for rich coexistence, and we just highlight, what your levels are inside of your environment that will be critical to your deployment. Again, Active Directory cleanup, one of the big deployment blockers. We're going to tell you up front, before you have to go and install directory sync, before, let's say, like Steve had mentioned, if you have more than 50,000 users, you have to first install a SQL Server, then install DirSync in order to see these errors, right? So what we're trying to do is move that, create this crystal ball up front and say, here are the things that you want to resolve before ever really getting to that stage. So in this case, there's unsupported SAM account characters, and if you click on that, it's going to show you which ones those are. There's some questionable first names, last names, display names. You can make questionable be anything, but what we do know is most likely your parents didn't name you with a plus sign or a question mark or whatever the case is, right? So we're going to try and find that for you up front. Mail attributes. What doesn't typically look like a mail attribute, what we define that, and that's defined the rule set that we put at the end of the MAGI or the deployment guide. Probably a really big one is duplicates. This person looks like Mason Daniel is in the directory twice with the same mail attribute. What happens when you directory sync them in is the first one in gets an account and shows up inside of the portal. The next one doesn't. So in order to identify those, I'm not sure if we've run the CSV tool to find out. When you click on this, we'll give you the DNs of which people have the same mail value, right? So it looks like Emily and Madison have the same mail value. You'll need to make the determination which one should have which mail value, and then update that in the directory, and then move on, right? So we look at the different attributes that need to be cleaned up. We tell you up front, okay, it looks like even though we don't need enterprise admin rights to run this tool, but it looks like you're good to go when you have to deploy directory sync, because you do need enterprise admin rights to deploy it. So we find that, we tell you that you have there. Like Steve was talking about, object count, right? So we know that there's a 50,000 user limit for SQL, but if you're at 10,000, we will tell you that you'll need to contact support first to exceed that limit. And the reason is we want to prevent denial of service attacks against the service. So you need to contact us first and make sure this is a legitimate, onboarding of a customer, right? Active Directory Recycle Bin, that's enabled. That has a difference on your quota. It'll affect your quota if, in fact, you have users that have been deleted but haven't been emptied from that recycle bin, if you will. User principal name. So this is the most important one, I feel. I mean, a lot of people have different views on what's critical. I think user principal name, especially when most of our customers are intending on deploying single sign-on, we're going to find the most, basically all the errors that you could potentially have with UPNs, and provide you which users have that error, and then give you the ability to go in and make those changes. This makes a huge difference in expediting your deployment, right? So if you were doing this during the deployment, as you've got a lot of things, a lot of areas that are happening in parallel, this will have a dramatic effect on your overall velocity if you're doing this during the deployment. If you're able to proactively address these issues in advance of the deployment, it will have a significant effect on overall end user satisfaction and your satisfaction, not having to be up doing these deployments, at rough times of the day. So we go through that. We provide you the information. Again, if the value or the issue is found, we determine where it is, tell you where to go to fix it. We tell you, okay, it looks like these are the domain suffixes that are in use. In this case, like I was saying, this one is not going to work. msodex.local is not a routable user principal name, so we'll flag it, and then we'll tell you where we found it, and effectively the guidance to what you have to do to change that, right? So in the deployment guide, we give you the details that you need to know to make that change happen. If you intend on doing a non-federated deployment, or at least setting up accounts with non-federated identities, we'll tell you up front, okay, it looks like you have 7 character password length where the service itself needs, I think it was at 6 minimum, but we tell you that this is what your environment has. We'll explain what we found on premises with Exchange, how many users have the value of default, which is true or false for their mailbox size, and then if they have an Exchange orgs level set for their mailbox size, we highlight that. If you have link on premises or OC on premises, we tell you which SIP domains we discovered. The important factors that you'll need to know, not just for planning, but overall understanding the environment that you're working with, right? So some of these reports will come up pretty, clean. Some will come up with lots of issues that you want to make sure you knew, and up front that will have a dramatic effect on your deployment. This environment, there's only 3 machines, but we looked for machines that had made a secured channel with a domain within the last 90 days, and of those, 3 of them were found. And of those 3, we found the ones that were ready to consume Office 365 with a rich experience. So, we found 1 Windows 7 machine, RTM, and then 2 Service Pack 1. So this customer would be ready to roll. Once we got your proxy addresses, we then go and pull up the relevant DNS information. So we do the port query test, which we'll look and see if the endpoints are good. But we also look and see, you're going to need to enter DNS records inside of the Office 365, inside of your DNS manager. And they'll be provided to you inside of the online portal. We'll check for those DNS records, and if they exist, you'll see them pop up with a checkbox. If they don't, we don't show them here, but we just give you the information that we discovered. So, a lot of stuff covered. That's pretty much it with the demonstration and the overall presentation. The mics are in the middle. If you have any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer them. So, go ahead.
Hello, is this on? Yep. I have a question about the Active Directory Federation services.
Sure.
I like the fact that it integrates the single sign-on.
Yep.
But you're reliant on your ADFS infrastructure to be up and running to be able to access the services.
Yep.
Is there any way to have some kind of complete DR where that's not reliant?
Well, you definitely have to have an infrastructure for single sign-on, and you do need to plan for redundancy. It's no different than Active Directory, for example, right? You can't just have one domain controller and expect that you would, in a disaster, be okay, right? So basically, the way I would describe it is it's just an add-on to your Active Directory infrastructure that provides additional layer of authentication or a different mechanism of authentication for, in this case, the cloud, right? I know that Ross, who's here, Ross Adams has a session that, actually, let me just go to those sessions real quick. So these sessions that, we'll come back here in a second, are excellent. Oh, sorry, they're not the sessions. There we go. Here, the sessions that are listed here, we have specifically for the key areas I talked about. So this session was really designed to give you like the overview, broad, end-to-end. The deep dive questions, I think tomorrow is, I guess it's not here anymore. There it is. There's a session. Ross, what's your session? OSP 215. That will be a great session if you have some deep dive questions about single sign-on ADFS that we can answer. But in a nutshell, the answer to your question is that you really do need to plan for and design for redundant infrastructure for ADFS. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have two.
Sure.
The first is I'm an existing BPOS customer, so and we use the single sign-on. So it seems like the password is kind of your main security control.
Sure.
So don't you think 16 characters is a little short for a ceiling, especially if you're going to encourage people to use passphrases?
So do you think, will your customers, or I'm sorry, will you likely not choose single sign-on on premises, or do you think you're going to use managed IDs?
I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
Because we're not up for our deployment yet, and we
Yeah.
haven't done our plan.
Okay.
But when I saw that it was 16 characters max, it seemed
Yeah.
a little short
Sure.
because you want to encourage them to have a stronger password if that's kind of their only control.
Yeah, so that's a good point. What we planned for was, if that didn't work out for you, single sign-on would be the best solution because you can use your on-premises directory and make, whatever your password policy is that you'd like. But definitely something I can pass on to the V1 team.
And the other question I had was, you talked about managing mailbox sizes and such, but you didn't mention anything about archival options available with the basic service.
Yep.
Do I just need to RTFDG or
So.
deployment guide?
So the service description actually goes in depth really well as to what you can do, and you can start planning for that now, right? Even as a BPOS customer today. Very cool features that were never available in the past, right? Yeah, but if you go through the service description, I mean, and I'm not sure if you've played with the beta or had a separate account on that, you can plan for that now before you go into that transition period and be ready for it when we go to Office 365 or Office 365 is available at GA. What other questions do we have?
We're a BPOS user currently. As you go and activate a domain and you migrate, activate that domain in BPOS,
Yep.
as we're a partner and we're on BPOS, we can no longer send that user emails because it routes all the emails directly to the account where the users aren't created yet.
Yep.
Is there anything in Office 365 that's going to make that a little bit more seamless?
I think the answer is yes, and there's a session on that, I think, tomorrow, just about moving from BPOS, transitioning, let's see here. Wednesday. Go to that session. It's going to be a good session. I think the PM actually that runs that will be.
And the second question, as an Australian, when will Office 365 be available? It's
I think
available for New Zealanders, and it's a bit of an embarrassment, it's a bit of a slap in the face.
Is it because of Telstra? Aren't you guys syndication
well, I mean, I
partner?
suppose that's a bigger question. Are you going to give us a different choice? We seem to be the only country in the world that seems to miss out on these things.
Yeah, I know those guys very well in the syndication partner team. I can relay that to them. But there's no beyond what we're doing today. I'm not sure if that's going to change at all.
We register as New Zealanders, Austrians, anything else to get onto the products. It's crazy.
Okay, very good point. Sorry. Next question, please.
Yeah, I think on the second thing you had, you need to change the CNAME record so the email is accepted up in the cloud. Is that what that's for?
Oh, no, that's just to say that you prove that you own domain ownership, right? You own that domain. So once you put your that value that we assign you, which is MS and then 8 characters, and then put ps.microsoftonline.com. It's just what we'll do is we'll validate that we know that you put that information, that you own that domain because we gave you that information, and then you have to do that in your domain registrar's database. And if that shows up, then we know you did it, right?
Here's kind of why I was asking that. We have a SendMail server that accepts all kinds of email.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure out how to move some accounts up to Office 365 and how to route the mail up to them. Does that make sense?
Those are different things. But I'd be more than happy to talk to you offline.
Okay, let's do that.
Sure.
Yeah, I have a question about the single sign-on and managed sign-on. I have some users that are not in my domain. Can I mix and match? Some users have this Active Directory single sign-on, and some still use the existing.
So if let's say that your domain is contoso.com, everybody has to be federated if it's Contoso, right? But I know in Ross's session he'll talk about how you can. There's some other things that you can do, but specifically, if you want to have everybody maintain that namespace, it's federated by namespace.
By namespace, by domain?
Yeah.
Okay. that domain space is not the same as their email address.
Just for giggles and grins, I can speak. It was his show. I'll be at the Learning Center down at the on the floor all week. If you have any deployment questions, you can stop on by. I'll be happy to have a discussion and/or whiteboard out with you.
Go ahead.
In the
You have migration tools to move people up to the cloud, and tools to move them back. Can you move people back to the on-premise?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so that's what's really cool
That's
about.
one of the things as we've segmented our users, some people can't go, or their role will change.
Yep.
If they're up in the cloud, they can come back.
Yeah, so the question, which is a great question, I don't think I mentioned it. We do provide with rich coexistence the ability to offboard and onboard. There's some constraints that you'll have to understand, like you'll need to enable what's called directory sync write back. That means that we need to write back to your directory. Today it's a one-way write. We'd have to do a two-way write because we'll need to take the proxy address, the X500, those sorts of things, and move those back on premises and route where your mailbox is, right? So there's a session on directory sync, I think on Wednesday. That's the one. If you have questions about offboarding, that's a good session to go to.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question regarding the sync password solution. That on the slide
Sorry, can you-
ID,
can you move a little closer to the mic?
Yeah. Okay. On the slide for ID synchronization, you had three options like federated ID, live ID, and then for some third-party solutions. So for password sync. So
Yep.
you're going to provide some API to sync passwords from like maybe AD or other directories and sync
Yeah.
identities.
Yeah, so today we have partners, I'm trying to think, so Celestix, and then there's I'm trying to think, is it Metalogics? There's another one that's out there that'll do password sync if you choose managed IDs, right? So what they do is they put an API, or they put a
Shim.
filter on, a shim, a filter on top of your AD, and then when your password changes, they send a password change notification to the cloud and another service if you have another thing that you want to have the same password. And so we have a partner in that space that assists with that. So if you go to inside the online deployment guide, I believe, no, actually we don't have it referenced there, but
Help.outlook.com has that as well, because
Yeah.
we use that in the educational space.
yeah, but basically the answer is we don't natively provide this API, but it's possible to do is probably the best way to say it. And we allow third-party tools to do that for you. So it's third-party API.
Oh, okay, so it's only during the catching the reset of the password and sending the same command to the cloud, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, but effectively, it will give you the result that you're asking for, yeah.
Yeah. And just a little feedback, I was pretty disappointed you didn't have the hands-on lab for rich coexistence, for setting up rich coexistence.
We didn't have a demo of that?
No hands-on lab.
Oh, the hands-on lab doesn't have it.
hands-on.
Yeah.
Well, the reason is just, I guess I'm not sure if I'm on the clock still, but we are changing that. So there's going to be some enhanced features, what we call a wizard, a Service Pack 2 wizard that you'll see. And that's why we didn't want you to be detracted from some of the things that we'll do there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you.